It's terror time. Subscribe now and hit that like button so you don't miss any story. The first time I saw it was on a dead stretch of the A34, a cursed winding strip of tarmac between Newbury and Oxford. The night was a damp, black velvet, a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light from my old lorry's headlights one by one, like a living, hungry creature. Anyone who's driven these lonely roads knows they have a soul, an ancient, tired personality that whispers stories to those who will listen. Me, Arthur from Winchester, I'd heard those stories for over 30 years. I thought it was all nonsense, tall tales from those who'd slept too little and drunk too much, scare stories for new truckers. I'd seen everything, from livestock on the road to armed robberies, and I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. Until that night. The fatigue was a heavy weight in my bones, a weariness that went beyond the physical and into the soul. The road was deserted, a tunnel carved through the world of the living, and I was the only fool enough to be traveling through it. That's when a chill ran down my spine, that sudden ancient cold that doesn't come from outside, but boils up from inside the bones, a primitive warning that something was wrong, deeply wrong. My eyes, purely by instinct, jumped to the rear-view mirror. And it wasn't my own tired face, marked by sleepless nights and the eternal grime of the road, staring back. It was another man. Sitting in the back seat, perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees like a patient passenger waiting for his destination to arrive. His face was a blurred photograph, an image from a silent movie projected onto the darkness. It had no expression, just a pallor like a full moon, with eyes that were two dark, empty smudges, two holes punched through reality. My heart gave a violent leap inside my chest, a nail of adrenaline driven straight into my most primal instinct. I blinked rapidly, shook my head hard, clenched my eyes shut and opened them again, certain that exhaustion had finally claimed me, that my senses were betraying me. When I looked again, the back seat was empty. Just the darkness and the irregular shadow of my jacket hanging from the peg. I breathed a sigh of relief, a trembling, shaky sigh that fogged the windscreen for a second. It was just fatigue, I convinced myself. The legend was just a legend, a story to scare impressionable people. But a seed of absolute dread had been planted deep in my mind, in a dark place I never knew existed. In the following miles, my eyes became traitors, constantly fleeing to the mirror, checking, confirming the solitude. And it was always empty. Slowly, the tension began to dissipate, replaced by an inward shame for having fallen for such cheap superstition. I was Arthur, a serious man from Winchester, not a boy frightened by ghost stories. The road whispered its secrets to the trees lining the tarmac, and I ignored them all. Until, for no apparent reason, without any sound or light, my body forced me to look once more. He was there. No longer a ghostly image, but more defined, more substantial. This time, I could make out the line of his shoulders under a dark jacket, the outline of his short, dark hair. He was no longer looking forward, expressionless. His head was slightly tilted, and those black smudges for eyes now seemed to be drilled in my direction, piercing through the glass and the distance between us. A trickle of icy sweat ran down my back, soaking my shirt. It wasn't fatigue. It was real. It was tangible in a way that froze the blood in my veins. I stomped on the accelerator with near-brutal force. The engine roared in protest, and the lorry gained speed, swaying dangerously with the weight of its load. I tore my gaze from the mirror, focusing with desperate intensity on the yellow line snaking ahead, a tenuous thread of sanity in the midst of that madness. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The radio, playing a low folk tune, seemed to come from another world, distant and irrelevant. When I felt I was at a safe distance, the animal need to confirm the danger, to measure the threat, overcame pure fear. It was a stupid, suicidal impulse, and I obeyed. I looked. He was closer. Inexplicably, He was no longer leaning against the back seat. He was in the middle of the cab, still sitting in mid-air, as if the seat had silently moved forward, bringing him with it. His arms now rested on the back of the passenger seat. His hands, pale and with bluish veins like maps of dry riverbeds, were clearly visible, his fingers slightly curved. The details of his face had deepened. I could see the shadow of stubble, the defined curve of a nose, the thin, cruel line of his lips, which seemed frozen in a slight frown of morbid curiosity. The worst was the eyes. They were still dark, but no longer empty. There was a consciousness in them, a focused and ancient intelligence that studied me, that dissected me with a clinical and terrifying interest. A low, almost animal groan escaped my throat. I was trapped inside my own cab, moving at 100 kilometers an hour in a metal cage with a thing that did not obey the rules of physics, reason, or reality. Every fiber of my being screamed to stop the lorry, wrench the door open, and flee into the darkness outside. But a deeper, more terrified voice whispered that the darkness outside was infinite, but the darkness inside the lorry had a face and a presence. Stopping would be surrendering. Stopping would mean being trapped, motionless, with it. The fear of stopping was greater than the fear of going on. The road was my only lifeline, even if it was taking me deeper into the nightmare. And then I made the final mistake. The road curved gently to the left, and for a brief instant, the tail lights of a distant car, perhaps someone from Abingdon heading home, illuminated the interior of the cab with a fleeting blood-red glow. It was enough. The need to see, to know, was stronger than any instinct for self-preservation. I looked in the mirror, and he was no longer sitting. He was standing, bent over, because the cab wasn't tall enough for his stature, which now seemed absurdly tall and disproportionate. His face was now less than a hand's breadth from my shoulder. I could feel the cold emanating from him, a cold of wet cemetery stone, of turned earth, of a total absence of life. His eyes, deep and intelligent, stared at my reflection in the mirror with unbearable intensity. And for the first time, those thin lips moved. Not into a smile, but into a silent recognition. A minimal, almost imperceptible nod. He knew I saw him. He had always known. And he was satisfied, not because he had frightened me, but because he was becoming real, because he was crossing the frontier that separates legend from flesh. The terror I felt then was no longer an emotion. It was a state of being, a permanent condition, a physical, crushing weight that flattened my lungs and paralyzed my limbs. The road ahead ceased to exist. The sound of the engine died, replaced by a sharp, constant ringing in my ears. All that existed were those eyes in the mirror and the penetrating, solid, almost solid cold on the nape of my neck. I did not dare turn around. To turn would be to accept his physical presence once and for all. It would be to cross a line from which there was no return. It would be to give him the final permission he seemed to be waiting for. And that's where the story always stops, isn't it? You've heard this legend before, in motorway service stations, on late-night radio shows. The driver looks in the mirror, sees the ghost, screams, and vanishes. A story to give you a little thrill before moving on, a harmless diversion. But let me tell you something, a truth that only those who have felt this particular cold on the back of their neck, who have felt the car seat sink for no reason, truly know. The legend is wrong. The absolute danger, the true moment of your end, is not when you look in the mirror. It's when you stop looking, because that's when your other senses take over. It's when you feel the passenger seat, the one that's been empty for thousands of miles, sink slightly, with a low, definitive sound of springs compressing, as if a considerable, solid, undeniable weight has sat down beside you. It's when you hear, above the ghostly noise of the engine and the ringing in your ears, the low, perfectly regular sound of a breath that is not your own. An inhalation, an exhalation, calm and patient, like that of someone who has waited a very, very long time for that moment. You no longer need to look in the mirror, you know. with a certainty that goes beyond fear and enters the territory of prophecy. You know that if you turn your head to the side, to the seat that should be empty, you will find that pale, conscious face already looking at you, from a distance that no longer allows for denial, prayer, or escape. The legend is about the reflection. The reality I am living right now as I drive toward Bicester with a silent passenger beside me, is about what happens when the reflection decides to become real, to step down from the mirror and claim its place by your side, forever. And it always decides to become real. It always comes along for the ride. And the final destination of this journey, well, that destination is no longer mine. The first time I heard the bells of St. Dunstan's Church was on a stifling summer night in York, when the warm wind carried more than just the scent of rain, it carried the past. It wasn't a random sound, a chaotic clanging of old metal. It was a melody, precise and deliberate, that cut through the midnight silence like a knife. It was exactly midnight. I, a skeptical historian named Thomas, had moved to that city months ago to escape the noise of Manchester, seeking peace to write my book. Peace, I quickly discovered, is a relative concept in places where history isn't just written in books, but carved into the stones and whispered on the wind. The church, a stone skeleton on the edge of the hill, had been abandoned for decades, ever after a landslide buried the access road and made it a forgotten place. The older residents, like old man Alfred, the owner of the pub where I bought my bread, spoke of it with fearful respect. He told me, on a rainy afternoon, about the Plague of Tears, a sickness that swept the region in the 18th century, wiping out children. The sick, legend said, were isolated in a pest house near the church, and at night, the mothers would sing a sad lullaby, a funeral prayer, to calm the little ones who wouldn't see the dawn. The melody of the carillon, he stated with a gravity that made me laugh inside, was exactly that song. I laughed back then. I attributed it to the fertile imagination of an old man and the power of ghost stories that every historic town cultivates. Until that night. The melody was undeniably frightening, a sequence of deep, drawn-out notes that didn't sound like a religious hymn, but like a slow, heavy funeral march. It lasted exactly 3 minutes, and then the silence returned, denser and heavier than before. I tried to ignore it, to attribute it to the wind or some acoustic phenomenon, but a deep unease planted its roots in my chest. The next night, there I was, on the porch of my small house, waiting. And at midnight, the bells rang again. The same perfect, sinisterly sweet melody. This time, I wrote down the notes on a piece of paper, a pathetic attempt to rationalize the irrational. It was after this second night that the dreams began. They weren't ordinary nightmares. They were vivid, olfactory. I was always on the same cobblestone street, in a York of the past, with dark townhouses and gas lamps. The smell was the worst, a sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh and wet earth, of open sores and despair. And the figures, God, the figures. They shuffled in the shadows, not skeletons, but bodies in an advanced state of decay, covered in a dark, pulsating mud, with white, milky eyes. They whispered, not with words, but with a sound of liquid gurgling in drowned lungs. The lullaby was the background music to these visions of horror. I would wake up gasping, my heart beating like a desperate drum, the smell of plague still permeating my bedroom, even with the windows closed. The line between dream and wakefulness began to dissolve. On a foggy day, coming back from the market, I swore I saw one of those mud-caked figures standing in an alley, its pestilent silhouette dissipating in the mist as soon as I blinked. It was my mind, of course, it had to be. The fatigue and the stress. It was then that I decided to do what any historian would do, research. The city archives confirmed the Plague of Tears, and in a moldy book of hospital records, I found the sheet music for that lullaby, called The Little Angel's Farewell. The notes I had written down matched perfectly. A chill that was no longer of fear, but of pure terrifying certainty, ran down my spine. This was real. The carillon was playing the Song of the Dead. And then, something shifted. The sounds were no longer restricted to midnight. I began to hear the low, distant tolling during the day, a ghostly echo behind the noise of traffic, the murmur of people. The figures in my dreams stopped just whispering. They began to stare at me. And in one of those dreams, one of them more defined, with shreds of ragged clothing stuck to its pustulant skin, stretched an arm toward me. I didn't wake up immediately. I was paralyzed, feeling the damp cold of that hand about to touch me. You listening to me now, comfortably far from here, might think it's just a story, a tale to send a shiver down your spine. I used to think that too. But let me tell you something I discovered in the worst way possible. The past is not dead. It is only sleeping, waiting for the right signal to awaken. And some doors, once opened, can no longer be closed. Last night, I no longer needed to dream. I woke to the sound of dragging in the hallway, a wet, heavy sound, accompanied by that same sweet, nauseating smell of my nightmares. The melody of the carillon echoed faintly in my mind, a thread connecting me to the horror that was now materializing on the other side of my wooden door. The lock, I saw with a terror that paralyzed my soul, began to turn slowly, corroded by a black, viscous substance that dripped onto the metal. Fear is no longer what I feel. It is an icy resignation. They are no longer just in the dreams of those who hear the melody. They are entering reality. And the melody, I realize now as the first muddy, deformed finger appears in the crack of the door, was not a warning. It was an invitation. And I, fool that I was, accepted. I never believed in demons until I understood that the worst ones don't need exorcisms, just a crack in your soul. My name is Peter, and my perfect family became a silent battlefield for things that have no name, things that feed not on blood, but on broken bonds and murdered trust. It all started in our house in Oxford, an old building full of history that we, fools that we were, thought was charming. The evil didn't arrive with a bang, but with the silence of a thief entering through the window you yourself left open. The first signs were so insignificant I can only see them now, from the bottom of the pit. It was the milk souring inexplicably a day after purchase. It was the feeling of being watched even when I was alone at home. It was the sound of footsteps upstairs when everyone was asleep. My wife, Sophie, a practical woman full of life, began to wake up with deep dark circles under her eyes, complaining of nightmares where something watched her from the corner of the room. Our daughter, Emily, 12 years old, began to isolate herself, locked in her room, whispering to someone, or something. She called her invisible friends. My son, Liam, 8 years old, began to draw distorted and anguishing figures of shadows with many eyes and stitched-up mouths. The atmosphere at home became heavy, oppressive, like the air before a violent storm. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was charged, electric, full of unspoken things. And then, the whispers began. They weren't audible, not in the conventional way. They arrived inside our minds, implanting thoughts that were not our own. I began to doubt Sophie's fidelity for no reason at all, rummaging through her desk drawer looking for something that didn't exist. Sophie, in turn, began to accuse me of being distant, of hiding secrets, of planning to abandon the family. We, who had always communicated so well, now communicated through whispered accusations and suspicions. Emily became a master in the art of subtle cruelty. She whispered in her mother's ear that I called her fat and unsatisfactory in conversations with my friends. She whispered to me that Sophie found my body repulsive and was planning to leave me for a younger man. Liam, my sweet boy, began to reproduce swear words and adult concepts we had never heard at home, with an empty, distant smile on his face. The house smelled of damp and something sweeter and rotten, like old flowers left in a vase with stagnant water. None of us were who we used to be. We were distorted, bitter versions of ourselves, driven by a cold rage and a sick jealousy that had no real origin. The entities didn't need to fully possess us. They didn't need to speak through our mouths or twist our heads. They just amplified our worst insecurities, our deepest fears, and watched, impassive, as we ourselves destroyed everything we had built. And they watched. I could feel their gazes, not physical, but a pressure on the nape of my neck, a cold presence in a warm room. Sometimes, I saw shadows moving in my peripheral vision, shadows that dissolved when I turned my head, always still, always watching. The violence that set in wasn't physical, it was emotional, it was psychological. It was a torture of daily pinpricks, of small stabs in the back delivered with smiles on our lips. It was Sophie breaking my favorite mug by accident, and then smiling with a coldness that didn't belong to her. It was Emily forgetting to tell me about an important meeting at school, making me look like a disinterested father. It was Liam looking at me with a pure, primal hatred that no 8-year-old child should possess. I knew we were lost when I found Sophie in the basement, sitting on the concrete floor, staring at the wall. She didn't respond when I called her name, just swayed gently back and forth. When I touched her shoulder, she turned, and her eyes were empty, like a fish's, without recognition, without life, just an ancient, tired presence looking through her. She whispered, in a voice that was hers and yet wasn't, "They like it when we fight. It's what feeds them." That was when I realized we weren't possessed by a single entity, but by many, perhaps dozens, like worms crawling through the foundations of our house and our souls, sucking our vital energy, our happiness, our love. They were low-level demons, as you must be thinking, perhaps less impressive than those in the movies, but infinitely more perverse. Their violence wasn't spectacular. It was a slow, methodical erosion. You listening to me right now might think this is just a story. You might look at your partner, your children, and feel safe. But I ask you, are you absolutely sure that cruel thought about your spouse was truly your own? Sure that your child's moment of disproportionate anger was just a tantrum? How do you know there isn't something hovering over your house, feeding silently on the small friction of daily life, amplifying it, turning home into a minefield of resentment? How do you know? Here, there is no salvation left. I'm locked in my study, writing this on an old laptop. I can hear them out there, Emily's light footsteps, Liam's whispers, Sophie's soft crying. They are no longer my family. They are shells, hosts for things that laugh at our weakness. The smell of rotten flowers is so strong I can almost taste it. And I know that soon, very soon, the lock on my door will begin to turn. Not because they will break it down, but because the whispers inside my own head will convince me it's safer to open it, that I deserve this, that I want this. And I will open it. They don't need violence, just persuasion. And I, Peter, the father, the husband, the man who once had a family, will become just another silent host, watching, impassive, the final ruin of everything I once loved. And the true owners of the house will watch, and they will feed.